Lucinda? Thank you. So let me see, I gotta continue. So are we ready to go, folks? We got everybody let in, Lucinda? I think Lucinda locked up. Am I good to go, Lucinda?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. My name is Keith Smith. I'm the chair of the Regional Housing Partnership. I want to thank everybody for joining our final session of the spring series that we're doing. We're going to be talking about equity in housing. So everybody knows this event is recorded, and we're going to release on our website later this week. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the good doctor who will be moderating the rest of this session. In your chat box, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the chat box. We will have a portion at the back end of this presentation for Q&A. So if you put them in there, Lucinda and myself and staff will be monitoring them, and we will throw some of these questions at our panelists at the back end of this presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stacy Peppier. The good doctor, besides being a very dear personal friend of mine, is the housing policy manager for Albemarle County. I had to look there, make sure I got the title right, Stacy. But Stacy, I'm going to hand this off to you and introduce the rest of our panelists. Just as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat box, and we will do our very best to get them to them at the back of the program.
Yeah, thank you. And my title is new, so I understand not remembering what I'm called. I appreciate that.
I just call you rock star. Is that good enough? Does that cover everything?
That'll work.
And I bow to the general direction.
So again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited about today's session. I think it's a really important topic, and I'm also excited about the panelists we have joining us today. And those are Kate Howe. She's an associate professor of urban planning in the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. She is also the co-director of the RVA Eviction Lab, a community responsive data lab housed at Virginia Commonwealth University. We also have Hamilton Lombard. Hamilton is a demographer at the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center, where he estimates current and projects future changes in the populations of Virginia's counties and cities. Over the past decade, Hamilton has frequently worked with local governments in the TJPDC region to help them better understand the populations they serve. And we have Andrew Monshine. He is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. He studies transportation systems and travel behavior, seeking to foster equitable, sustainable accessibilities in cities and regions. Andrew is a faculty affiliate of the UVA Equity Center and serves on the City of Charlottesville's Place Task Force. So thank all three of you for joining us today. I was excited by the conversation we had earlier this week to set the stage for our discussion. And so I hope we have a good one this afternoon. Just to get us started off, could each of you, since you study different aspects of communities, can you talk a little bit about the work that each of you do? And Kate, how about we start with you?
Oh boy, I love going first. It's my favorite. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Stacy mentioned, I sort of have two different hats, I would say, that I work on, and two sort of research areas that I engage in. The one that's sort of most obvious, I guess, would be with the RVA Eviction Lab. And as Stacy said, we're a community responsive data lab, and that means that we have a few different audiences for what we do, and that's anybody from decision makers who are saying, hey, what are the eviction rates in my community? What does that look like, and who is impacted? And so we've provided maps and reports and things like that. But I think one of the more interesting things that we've been able to work with is actually sort of community-based organizations who are trying to either provide direct service or conduct organizing work to get tenants involved in their work, in their futures. And so I would say that those are sort of one of the biggest areas of equity that I tend to work in is work with the lab. and our work at sort of democratizing data. The second piece is that I also work on questions of affordable housing preservation, which essentially is thinking about, okay, well, you know, cities are changing and affordable housing, our affordable housing supply is shrinking. And that has implications, yes, for the supply, and yes, for the kind of how do we build and how do we keep people housed for our economy, for our communities, all those sorts of things. But more importantly, that's about the communities that people have built and sort of the where they live and the networks that they've developed. And so how do we preserve not just the housing, but the communities within those spaces as well. So I'll stop talking now.
And Andrew, the work you do in transportation really has a direct impact on communities. So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for having me and all of us. My work, I am a transportation planner and worked as a transportation planner for many years. And coming back to do research, my research is really focused on this idea of accessibility in an urban and regional context, which is the idea of how our land use systems, as well as our transportation systems, working together actually make opportunities available to residents of communities, you know, whether it's an urban community, a suburban community, or the broader region. And so that's always driven my research. And specifically, I'm very focused on how accessibility really varies depending on where we live, as well as the types of transportation resources we have available to us. And those things have to work together. They can't function separately. And so the work that I do focuses in places where maybe we're not doing such a great job. And that often, you know, comes up when maybe somebody can't afford a car, but lives somewhere where you have to have a car. And so that's a condition that is pretty widespread, frankly, and certainly widespread in our region. And so a lot of my research focuses on that. And I think just briefly, I'll say, one of the things that I've worked on recently with partners at the UVDA Equity Center, Barbara Brown Wilson, the faculty director of the Equity Center, as well as Camille Burnett, who's actually who's a nursing professor at UVA, but now actually moved on to Kentucky. We did focus groups with residents of public housing, low-income workers at UVA, as well as the Latinx community that lives outside of the city of Charlottesville, to really understand what those needs for getting to opportunities, whether it's work or healthcare, really are. And so some of the things we talk about might focus on that. And some of those needs are really based on where you live and the types of housing you have available, as much as it is very much about the types of investments we make in infrastructure.
Great, thank you. And Hamilton, as a demographer, you're not often in the spotlight when it comes to talking about community and equity and housing, but give us a little background into what you do and how you can help support efforts.
Sure. A lot of the work I do is tracking population change and trying to predict it all across Virginia. So there's 133 counties and cities, but I do also look at the region we're in. And for today's conversation, the estimates we produce show that the region's grown by a little over 20,000 in the last decade. That's a little less than it grew in the early 2000s, about the same as the 1990s, about the same as the 1980s. So we have very steady growth in the area. And that makes predicting growth fairly easy. We're predicting probably another 20,000 over the next decade, a little more than 20,000 over the following decade. One way to think of those numbers is, since 2000, we've essentially built another Charlottesville in the TJPDC. We've added that much population, built that much housing. We also did that from 1980 to 2000. And if our projections are accurate, and I think they're probably more accurate locally than some other parts of the state, we're probably going to need to build another Charlottesville in the TJPDC over the next 20 years. So kind of one way of thinking of some of the numbers we produce locally. We also do a lot of different work with local government, sometimes with state agencies, universities. I was talking with Keith earlier about some work I did in the initial stages of forming UVA's Affordable Housing Task Force. One statistic I remember that really jumped out at me was when you look at housing costs in Armagh and Charlottesville relative to income, housing is more expensive here than any metro area in Virginia, including North Virginia. And that it stands out. And I think one demographic reason possibly for that is how much migration we get from the Northeast, where housing is already quite expensive, so it doesn't seem so expensive here. income levels are higher. And that pushes up, I think, housing costs in the area were very attractive. And I think that's part of why we're having the conversation today about affordable housing.
Great, thank you. Since today's session really is about equity, and there is a lot of movement locally and across the country to begin addressing issues related to community equity. But I think the concept of equity is often not well defined or understood. What do you think equity looks like at the community level? And Andrew, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, that's great. Kate doesn't have to go first. Yeah, I think that, you know, the question of what is equity is a big one, and it's a discussion that, you know, we're having over and over again as we try to get to a definition. But I think at the level of the community, I'm an urban planner, and I really think about it as a planner, to think about the fact that when we try to make cities work for everyone, and, you know, fundamentally that's a goal we have, that's a, you know, an ethical goal, a moral goal, a normative goal. How do we do that with our policies and our plans? And how do we actually make choices as community members and community leaders that actually gets us to the vision we have for equal opportunity, for opportunities to live well, to find means of getting income in our economy, to be healthy? Community equity means looking at the systems we have and making choices that actually support multiple groups of people. So to me, equity is really about how we do things as much as it is in terms of the end state. The only other thing that I would say before handing it over to my colleagues here is just to say that, you know, a lot of times when we do analysis of equity, we're looking at different neighborhoods, things like that. But I think, you know, we can do a better job by really looking at how equity functions across different groups of people, because it's not always just about where you are. It's about where you are and what means you have, what resources you have, and other factors as well.
Great. Hamilton, thinking data-wise, as you're the data person here, what does equity look like from a data perspective?
Well, I agree that it's a little hard to define. And when I was taking financial economics courses, we had a pretty clear definition of equity, but it's not, I think, the same one we're talking about. It's hard. I think it's hard to quantify. I think one of the points, maybe from a data standpoint, is it may be dangerous trying to quantify it. One example is, if you think of household structures, if you have a single family household with two earners, you're almost bound to have higher income because you have two earners versus somebody who lives alone. If you compare those households, you shouldn't expect them to have the same income levels. But I think when you're looking at planning and zoning, it is worth considering whether the systems we use were developed when 80% of the population lived in a single family household with two spouses, while today it's under 50%, the most common type of household is living alone. So some of it, I think, is, if you want to look at it from a data standpoint, you really have to make sure you're not doing a lot of apples and oranges comparison. A lot of times when you see differences, it could be because of the structures you see in the population itself. It could also be because of the history. It could be because of current conditions. But I think it's really difficult. I think I would say probably focus more on fairness and how you're doing things, which is probably a little less data-based.
I just muted myself. And Kate, on to you.
Well, I think luckily my colleagues here are pretty brilliant and have already said a lot of the smart things. And I think that, you know, on Hamilton's comment, I think it's really hard to define equity from the outside in. And I say that because I think that often how we define equity from outside of a community or outside of a community that's been historically excluded from power, from equitable conversations, is very different than how it might be from the other direction. And so I think it's really important for, I think equity, again, going back to what Andrew said, is really a large part about process, how we do what we're doing, who's involved, and how do we think about questions of power. We can't ignore the historic inequality of power and just say, well, we're just gonna distribute things equally. Well, even if we distribute everything equally, according to a fantastic set of data, it would ultimately be an unequal system because we have decades of inequality, and we would have some people who have better access to power, access to resources, access to credit, because of these sort of historic inequalities. And so I think we have to really put it all into context and think about questions of power before we can really deal with equity, because we can say, oh, we want, one of the big debates within housing is often, well, we want to deconcentrate poverty. Well, if you're living in those communities, that means that you're getting your neighborhood broken up. And that doesn't seem particularly equitable to me. And so, because if we said we're going to deconcentrate wealth, I will tell you, there's a lot of pushback when you say that. People get really upset. I can't believe you want to break up my neighborhood. Well, let's flip it around. And what are you saying to other folks when you say these things? What are we talking about with equity? So I do think that it's sort of this combination of questions. Yes, we need to think about outcomes, but those outcomes need to be derived through a better process than what we're doing now.
And I'm going to stick with you, Kate, because your discussion about power and that really relates to equity is really important. And have you seen in your work any changes as we have worked our way through the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, it had a lot of wide-ranging effects in all aspects of our lives. And how do you see, what types of impacts have you seen, particularly in relationship to power?
Well, I think, we had this great conversation, I guess, 2 days ago when we were prepping for this. And I think what we all kind of came to was that COVID-19 didn't change a whole lot of things. What it did was illuminated existing inequality. And so it wasn't, for when I started looking at the data and I was like, oh, well, sure enough, COVID-19 is hitting in the same places where eviction rates are really high, and are historically spaces that have been redlined, that were part of urban renewal projects, part of highway projects. And part of the foreclosure crisis. I was like, yeah, because they're all being driven by the same thing, and the thing that we haven't really been talking about, which is the sort of historic inequality. And so I think in housing, it's very vivid to me where these kind of inequalities lie. And again, when a big group of housers were in the room a few months ago, and I said that, and everyone was like, now what do we talk about? So, so I think that the conversation has to be then, okay, so how do we go beyond rent assistance, right? That's our sort of immediate need right now. And you could say, well, that's equity. Well, that's immediate need. That's not necessarily equity. And so that's kind of my hope, is that we sort of say, okay, well, great. We know there's some crisis moments here. We got to take care of the crisis, but what's the next step in terms of shifting the real ground that we're on?
Great, thank you. And Andrew, looking in terms of transportation, and I think oftentimes we don't think about transportation and equity and put those two together, but they really do. It plays a really important role in being able to make a more equitable society. So what effects have you seen on access to transportation?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I think that, the pandemic, just as Kay was saying, we all see how the pandemic really highlighted some of the real challenges that we're facing in terms of providing equitable opportunities, equitable systems. And in the transportation case, the pandemic showed that everyone's need from our transportation system is slightly different. And often there are communities of color, for example, that were frontline workers, working in service industries, working in grocery stores, that still had to travel. So all of our innovation around telecommuting and all of the policies that well-meaning, and they were good things, that we coped the way we could through telecommuting and opening up local streets to biking and walking to stay healthy, opening up parks. Those were great things, but they didn't actually mean that much to folks who still had to go to work, who still had to use the roads, who still needed to take transit when transit actually was cutting hours, was trying to find ways to accommodate people. And so what happens in transportation a lot, and it's no surprise, is that, we have great ideas that focus on a particular community, but often being part of that community might mean owning a car or having a kind of job or living in a particular neighborhood. And then we kind of, through our own, neglect maybe, but also potentially, historically through active racism. And today, potentially, we don't want to perpetuate these ideas, but we're just not thinking clearly about these issues. Is that we still don't invest in some communities and provide means of access. And so I think we can see those sorts of trends just perpetuating. By the way, I'd like to say, that's a big part of what's happening in transportation today is really thinking about this and thinking, listening to voices, who haven't been able to contribute to policy and planning. So I think there is change, and there's a lot more conversation. How that manifests is probably through different kinds of investments and different kinds of choices that we make.
Hamilton, slightly different approach to your question, but through your research into demographics, are you seeing or foreseeing any changes in how our region is, of our region, due to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think some of it, what you see locally is a lot of what you see nationally. The housing market had been gaining strength for years before the pandemic. It really took off the past year. Locally, if you look in the TJPDC, the number of permits issued for new residential units is up, I believe, over 50% this in 2020 over the previous 2 years. And so in some ways, it looks a lot like the mid-2000s. There was a lot of construction going on then. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the growth we're anticipating in population, you do need to build the housing for them. But when you look at the cost of housing relative to income, all the construction in the 2000s never narrowed that gap. And I think that's the difficult part with this. The other thing that really got turbocharged is telecommuting. Charlottesville had the highest telecommuting rate for any metro area in the state. It was one of the highest in the country even before the pandemic. I think, again, because it's an attractive place relative to Northern Virginia and Northeast, it was able to pull a lot of people out. We don't have a lot of data on what's happened since the pandemic. My assumption would be that when it's all done, you're going to have a much higher rate of people living in the area and maybe working in DC, but primarily being in the area. If you think about housing costs, that'll probably add more pressure. You'll have the wages in the Northeast and DC be down here. Economically, in some ways, is a good thing, but looking specifically at housing, it'll probably push up demand and prices.
That will just make my job a little bit harder over the next couple of years. We have about 7 minutes left, and I don't want us to end our conversation without thinking about how we can move forward in creating more equitable communities. So what are 1 or 2 steps we as community members, local government workers, policymakers can take to help support the creation of more equitable communities? Hamilton, do you have any ideas?
Yes, I do more population data than policy. As I mentioned, at the start, I do think one thing that governments could think about is just the idea that the TJPDC is going to have to build another Charlottesville the same way. If you know you need to build another reservoir or school, it has to be more than just an abstract. These are our general goals. Those homes will have to get built. And I think it's good to think about where they're going to get built and making sure that it's done in an equitable way. I think that trying to target it is going to be very difficult. Just one project I did several years ago with Charlottesville City Public Schools was looking at, in 2003, the city rezoned to allow higher density housing right around UVA. The idea was to keep UVA's enrollment from spilling out into single family neighborhoods. So it was very targeted, really at housing UVA students. But the public schools had some of the fastest growing public school enrollment in the state at the time. And this housing was to be for UVA students. So they're trying to figure out what happened. And when you went back and looked through all the student address data, birth data, matched up with housing, you realize that it was very successful. We saw all the apartments built on JPA, the corner, West Main Street, but a lot of students who had 4 or 5 was staying in a single family home now are in these apartments. A lot of families that had in the past moving out of Charlottesville to get housing out of the county were staying and enrolling the kids at public school. So in many ways, it was a good thing, but it also created a lot of population growth that wasn't even intended from it. So I think even if very targeted housing projects are done, there's still going to be a lot of side effects from that. You're still going to see growth in other population groups.
Thanks. Catherine, or Kate, sorry.
It's like you've gotten a little formal here, Stacy. I don't know. I mean, I think that we have to think about this, and I think Hamilton really kind of set this up nicely, is thinking about equity as an infrastructure. And I think that if we think about what things have to be in place to build equity, to build, you know, an equitable society, I think that gets to a whole different set of solutions. And that includes things like strengthening Black-led organizations that historically have had less access to philanthropic dollars, to state dollars, to other sorts of resources, have had less access to decision makers to sort of be involved in policy conversations and share grounded knowledge. I think that's a piece of kind of building the infrastructure for equity. I think we have to think about our land use. You know, to Hamilton's point there, I mean, we can't keep zoning single family and expect to not have increased sprawl and increased demands on our transportation as a result, and increased distances to work and costs of housing. I mean, there's kind of that, you know, density doesn't solve everything, but it certainly removes some barriers. And then I think one of the things that's been actually exciting to watch across Virginia has been and particularly in Charlottesville most recently, has been the focus on creating funding for affordable housing. Because, you know, if you think about affordable housing, there's a lot of different incomes you can target it, right? So you can target it at people who are maybe, you know, two people working full-time jobs with that are above minimum wage, you know, $15, $20 an hour. Okay, there's that population. There's folks who are just starting out in the working world with maybe a college degree, but they're not doing all that great. Then you have folks who are maybe single parents who are supporting, you know, family members, whether it's children or parents, who are then working a full-time job at minimum wage. Well, that's a very different set of affordable housing subsidies than the other groups that we're talking about, because this is a group that in many cases, or somebody who's on disability, some seniors on fixed incomes with Social Security, right? These are populations that the market is just not going to provide that. No matter how much density you do, you're never going to be able to make it affordable enough with just making it easier on the market. So you have to have subsidy to provide housing for those groups. Those folks are working at your grocery stores. They are stocking at Target. They are, you know, working at McDonald's. There are all these sorts of things and service sector jobs, cleaning and other sorts of spaces that we rely on, but they often can't afford housing. And so we have to really think about these kinds of deeper subsidies, of what we call deep subsidies, for those who are earning less than 30% of the regional income. And so I think that's something that's been exciting. And if you think about that as an infrastructure that allows you to do more things, I do think that we move closer to equity.
And Andrew.
Sure, yeah. You know, again, being able to build on Hamilton and Kate's points is, you know, is great. I think that, you know, one of the things that this organization, of course, really stands for, which I think is so critical, is the regionality of the issue. And I think if anything, you know, we've seen some progress, but there needs to be more resources available to work at the regional level, to plan at the regional level, and invest at the regional level, not just around transportation, which is something that is kind of built into the policy, but housing as well. And I think, you know, for those of us living here in the region, you know, we see what's happening with planning locally without thinking regionally in a really comprehensive way. And I think that housing and housing equity, you know, insofar as the way that a lot of people solve the challenge of finding affordable housing is to live really far away from where they want to be, you know, has to be thought of at this scale, or else we're not going to be able to solve the problems. I do think, though, I want to, yeah, I mean, you know, your organization, as well as the Regional Transit Partnership on the transportation side, there's a lot of good work happening. And then I think supporting that, supporting efforts by operators like Jaunt to find ways to provide accessibility even to folks who are living in suburban environments are really important. I think, in the end, it means doing a lot of the good things I think we know we should do, like investing in sidewalks, investing in all of those things to make housing an actual viable, no matter where you live, to make housing something that is useful, and to make the transportation system that comes along with it not something you have to buy into with high levels of resources, but something that is fundamentally there for everyone. And so we're doing those good things, I think, keeping the pressure up. Like Kate said, empowering organizations that haven't had a voice, Black organizations, immigrant organizations that just fundamentally haven't been part of the discussion. Or if they were, they weren't really heard in the past, which is something that is, we grapple with here in our region. Those are important parts of it. So yeah, there's a lot to do. And I think, we're hopefully on a good path.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. But Keith, I'll turn it over to you for the Q&A.
Well, we'll work together on that, Stacy. I'm just looking through a couple of questions here, and if everybody's okay, I'll just pass over the name of the person that posted it just for that. But there's a really great question here. Speaking to your individual organizations, and it would be very helpful for each organization to talk a little bit about, what your work is to help improve or work on the lens, or how this is seen out in the public to include diversity, equity, and inclusion. As somebody who's on the ground, who's dealing with this and this on a daily basis, some of the folks on this call, and whoever wants to jump in first, and we'll do a roundtable. So what is your organization doing to help? And a couple of follow-up questions just to be thinking about. I'd like you guys to be thinking about how we're going to fix this. Let's come up with some real world solutions that we can impose. So I'll let whoever wants to jump in first. All right, Andrew, you're first because you're the lowest left corner. How's that sound? That's all good.
Well, I think from where I sit, as somebody who thinks about transportation and thinks about equity, I guess what I'll say is that, yeah, I'm at UVA, which has a very distinctive history. And I think the UVA equity, which, not to put things under the rug, is, fundamentally a racist history going back to its construction and its founding. And so there's been a lot of thought that probably everyone on the call has read about, about how researchers at UVA are addressing this. And I've been privileged to participate in the work that many, my colleagues, Barbara Brown Wilson and Camille Burnett and many others are doing around thinking about equity in a constructive way, specifically within our region. And that, that fundamentally is the point of the work we've been doing, is to bring voices into the decision-making, the process of building transportation infrastructures and urban and regional systems, including housing and transportation together, that hear from individuals, Black folks, low-income folks, immigrants who haven't been able to participate in the past, and coming to specific conclusions, which, yeah, we can definitely talk about around that. I think that the way we do that is both from looking within, and that's a whole other conversation in some ways, but also thinking about how we can help communities and our own communities specifically make new choices that don't just focus on communities that we've always invested in, people who need parking lots, people who need wider roads, people who, like myself, who might be interested in having a more sustainable vehicle like an electric car, but instead really thinking about, well, how do these investments actually benefit everyone? And if they aren't, what are the things we can do in their stead by investing in transit, by investing in safe crossings of major roadways like US 29. So that's the way we frame the research we're doing. And it's a big task for sure.
So Catherine, or is it Kate?
That's fine, either one. I was going to jump in. So
good. There you go.
professors really fighting for the opportunity to talk too much.
I'm trying to manage you people. I got it.
It's hard. It's hard. I get it. So for us, really, I mean, we couldn't approach eviction. At least can't imagine a world in which we can approach eviction when we aren't talking about equity and inclusion. I mean, I think maybe it's possible, but we just couldn't imagine it because it's sort of two things. I'll start with kind of this macro piece, which is that, very quickly after 2018, when the Princeton Eviction Lab released their data that said that, Virginia had hit a top 10 list that no one wants to be on, where 5 of the top 10 highest evicting large cities in the country were in Virginia, and Richmond was the second highest. We very quickly realized, and we're not surprised when we mapped it and said, oh, wow, those are the same places where you have high non-white populations and where you have history of exclusion and inequality. And then when we actually did the analysis, we controlled for all these other factors, including things like home value and other sorts of things, and income. And we found that actually neighborhood racial composition was by far the largest predictor of neighborhood eviction rates, right? Like by double of any other factor in this equation, right? And so we're like, yeah, so that's a thing. And as we started talking about this, at events and things like that, we got a lot of pushback. But it sort of made us kind of dig in, and we're like, look, we can't not talk about this, Virginia. We've got to really kind of push ahead. And the conversation has definitely changed, I would say, in the past 3 years since we really first started talking about this. But that's kind of this macro picture, was that there is no way to ignore the fact that race, not income, not anything else, is one of the biggest factors that predicts eviction. And that has to do with our historic issues with race, some of which Andrew mentioned, right? And we can't ignore that. So on a micro level, we see equity in another way, which is that your landlord can find out everything about you, but you can't even figure out who your landlord is because your landlord is protected by an LLC. So that's an inequality of information. So you're coming into a rental agreement without the same information. And so for us, that was actually a huge issue. So not only as an individual coming into a rental situation, you have no idea the landlord's behavior. Do they evict people all the time? Do they have a whole bunch of code violations? Do they have some sort of history of getting foreclosed on? Who knows, right? Meanwhile, the landlord can know everything about your rental history, your credit, everything about you. And so we were like, that's not good. Okay, so that's an individual level. Then you can't even know, you won't be able to know who else lives in a building owned by that landlord. So you can kind of compare notes and get a sense of like, hey, are you seeing this happening? Because we're seeing this happening. Maybe we should do something about it. And that's incredibly disempowering from a collective organizing standpoint. And it makes it very difficult, even from a policy standpoint, to really do anything, because then you have to start to take it apart and say, wait, I've got these 4 buildings across the city who have code violations, and they kind of look a little similar, but I'm not sure. Who owns that? And it requires kind of going back through and actually doing some real forensic data work. And so what we said is, look, we've got to change that. We've got to get access to better data, better information to understand where evictions are happening, what kinds of buildings they're happening in, what kinds of tenants live in those communities, and what are some of the other compounding factors, so that we can actually make a better decisions from a policy perspective. And that's really about equity, but it's also getting access to this kind of data for tenants so that they can actually make better decisions and they can actually start to take their own futures in their hands. And that's a big piece of equity for us, is thinking about what data is available and who has access to it. How can it be used? And that how can it be used is something that I talk with actually Andrew's colleagues at the Equity Center about quite a bit, is that data can be weaponized. And so we have to really think about who's using it and how, and what does that actually tell us about communities, and what do we need to know?
Thank you, Kate. Hamilton, I'm going to twist the question around a little bit. I'm a data guy. I watch numbers. It's the business that I'm in. Again, from a numbers perspective, a data's perspective, I struggle with this all the time. I'm on multiple boards, multiple commissions, working on affordable housing. But as I look at the 4 of us, none of us look like the people that we're trying to serve here. And I struggle with this question of what can we do to bring in, to change that, that discussion, that dynamic, as one of the folks put in, change this lens. You know, we've got to figure out a way to do this. I mean, we're looking at numbers and data and all this fun stuff, but you know, what do you think we can do, the 4 of us or the 5 of us or the 59 or the 60 of us that are on this call, to help change that lens discussion? Something we can do tomorrow. Does that make any sense? I struggle with this all the time, brother. So
Yeah.
anything you can help would be great.
Well, I think one big thing I would say with data is, and this is true with race data, is there's a very big disconnect between people we know and see on the street and the race categories. If you look at Kamala Harris or Barack Obama, according to the census, neither are Black. They're multiracial. So they don't, when you look at data for the Black population, you're not looking at either of them. Most of the growth going on in the Black population today are people who would not go into the Black category. They're Black in another race, they're Black and Hispanic. So I think that's one thing to think about, is that it's becoming harder and harder to look at data and then look at your community and line the two up. Some places more than others. I did a lot of analysis of the last couple of years looking at race categories and also looking at income differences. And one of the things that really jumps out is college degree being such a big dividing line. And that's often used just as a cutoff. You're not going to be seen for a job application if you don't have a college degree. And I love going to UVA, but I just don't know if it was that big a difference that you shouldn't consider somebody with or without it. And that's when you look particularly at the Black population, that's the biggest dividing line. Is if you look in Virginia, Black Virginians with a college degree, the income gap is much, much, much smaller. Ones without, it's much, much wider. And I think rethinking the college degree requirement, most jobs we use do not require hard skills that you pick up in college. They're soft skills you might pick up there, you might pick up somewhere else. So I think that's one thing just to think about.
So I'm following some of the questions. Is one that just was interesting that just popped up, and it may be a little bit high level for the rest of the 15 minutes we have left, but there was a question, and I'm just going to paraphrase it. So the folks that asked the question, I apologize in advance, but it's talking about would raising the minimum wage or raising salaries be a little bit of a better approach than subsidizing the housing, or potentially subsidizing corporations that do this? So whoever wants to jump into first, how does that look at it? What's the positive, what's the negatives on that, and what impacts it might have on this conversation we're talking?
I'll just jump into that one because
Sure, because you're a professor and that's what you do.
Right? Yeah, no, I'm a housing professor, right? So
and I'm from New York, so go figure.
So I mean, so there's 2 ways that you can address housing, right? You can increase supply, or you can subsidize on one side, or you can subsidize on the other. And what you're saying is, do we increase wages, or do we increase subsidy? And that's absolutely yes, right? Yes. Wages haven't kept up with the cost of living, particularly with the cost of housing. We haven't raised the minimum wage significantly in decades, and it does not keep up with inflation. So absolutely. And that seems to me to always be like, well, yeah. But it's also a really hard conversation. And I mean, the Fight for 15 folks have been pushing this for years and years, and it's been a slow slog. So I think that the reason why we sometimes end up with subsidizing the housing side is often because as a political conversation, it's a little easier. That said, I think even raising the minimum wage is not necessarily going to do it, right? Because our housing, we would have to raise it even more than has been proposed to really get what's a living wage. And I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition has a great study every year. It's their gap report, I believe. It's basically how much housing we need at what income levels. And they have another report that shows how many hours at minimum wage you would need to work to afford the average 2-bedroom household or apartment. The spoiler alert here, and is that essentially no state in the country can you work 40 hours a week at minimum wage and afford the average 2-bedroom place. So of course that's absolutely the case. But I think it's a harder slog, and I think we would still need additional affordable housing because we still can't keep up with that. Our supplies are really low. And so when you look at that gap report that I talked about, We have, I think, around 30 to 35 affordable and available units for every 100 people who need them at the below 30% of the regional median income space. And that's only a little bit better for those below 50%. And those are those areas that I mentioned before the market doesn't provide. And so you would peel some off at the margin because suddenly you'd have fewer people in that category. But we're still talking about a really massive need that is not going to be covered by, this is a classic market failure issue. The market does not provide this.
Well, it's not a binary choice is what you're saying.
Correct.
You can't have, you got to have both. You just can't have
The answer is yes, right? Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, no, I like those kind of answers. Andrew, you want to take a stab at that? What do you think?
Sure. I mean, and I think, to be very clear, I'm a transportation person. And so, I don't want to step out of my, we're all specialists also in academia. So I want to be careful. But I think that
we won't tell anybody. Andrew.
But for you as a New Yorker, and I think I want to use the example of well, this bigger issue of, how do we provide a minimum basket of goods as local and regional planners, policymakers, people who create these places that are cities and regions. And I think that one of the interesting things about New York, let's say in comparison to what we do in Washington, DC, or well, actually even better, DC or in San Francisco, is that Metro, well, the MTA in New York, it's a flat fare, even if you're going all the way out to the far end of the Bronx on the subway. Whereas for BART or for Metro in DC, you have to pay depending on how far you go. And I think that, it's still expensive for a lot of people even to use MTA's system in New York City. But that legacy, for whatever reason, from a different era of making it one flat fare to use the transit system, which ultimately, at least originally more than 100 years ago, was meant to be affordable for everyone, affordable for maybe not people who had no incomes, but who had very low incomes, lives on. And it means that we guarantee something. We guarantee mobility. We guarantee access. I think it's housing, those sunk costs are a lot bigger than transportation. Transportation are ongoing costs. But I think that kind of way of approaching what we provide to communities is really important. And so that's why fare-free transit is a big discussion right now. Does it work? Does it help people get where they need to go, no matter how much money or how little money they have? Those are the kinds of discussions that I think really move, in a, like you said, in a concrete way, or whatever, asphalt, rail, whatever it is, in a fundamental way, move those things forward.
Well, in the
Move us
60s,
forward. Yeah.
in the 60s and the 70s, I used to jump turnstiles all the time. I think there's a statute of limitations, so I think I'm good with saying that. But one of the things that, we're just to wrap this conversation, I'm looking at a little bit of see if any more questions pop up in the feed. One of the beautiful things about this regional housing partnership is we bring these 4 pillars, and I will not use the term that Stacy does not like. So, healthy housing system. Okay, I said it. A healthy housing system is we bring all these entities to the table: the public, the private, the nonprofits, and the people who we serve. And one of the important people that we bring, or entities we bring to the table, is UVA. Right? Let's face it, UVA is the 10-ton, 20-ton, 30-ton, whatever you want to use, elephant in the room. If UVA wasn't here, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, right? It's the heartbeat, it's the engine that drives all this stuff. And so to answer that question, I always talk about with affordable housing, there's the equity part of it, which we're talking about, which is great. There's the adding of density, adding of units to it. But there's 3 other things that we're not talking about. We talked about transportation, and there's a question about transportation. I would encourage that person who asked that question to go back and look at last month's. We focused wholly on transportation. And Andrew, I wish you were part of it. That would have been a great conversation on that end of it. There's education, right? We're not talking about yet. And there's the health system, right? There's healthcare. So Andrew, after my little babbling, Hamilton, I apologize. After my little babbling, do you want to kind of try to take that and move it along in a different direction? Or do you want me to move on?
Education, healthcare, and
transportation. But my point I was trying to wrap around into how this all comes into equity. It's much more, in my opinion, much more than transportation or housing. There's other components that have to be considered into this total package. And I guess from a numbers guy, do you see any of that playing out?
One I'll just throw out there, and this is probably very unpopular, is just a little pity for UVA students. If you look at Charleston's poverty rate, technically most of the people in poverty are UVA students. Now, there, a lot of them actually have sources of income, but I would say 40% are going out with debt over 20,000. I do think that is part of it. There's often a push, blaming UVA students for a lot of the problems. As you said, we probably wouldn't be here without UVA, but they were also paying for a lot of that. They were paying high rents. The push to have them on grounds might be a good idea, but I remember from being at UVA, it was a bad deal cost-wise if you're a student. And I do think that there is no UVA student representative I really see in local government. And they're generally not a voice you hear a lot from. But I do think that when people are talking about the conversation, there should be a little bit more input from that, a little more thought towards them.
Well, it's taken me about 10 years to get UVA at the table. So this whole town and gown thing is happening. And so it's a beautiful step forward. Hamilton, you must have read my notes, because I wanted to, depending on the questions that come into the feed, I was going to ask you what your thought was on second years coming on campus, and will that help the affordable housing in the city and help this discussion we're talking about, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion? Is that going to help or is that going to hurt?
I think it will help probably families, particularly families that single family homes will be freed up. I live up Rugby Road, and the little road I live on, I think half the housing used to be UVA students. Now there's just one. I think a lot of that is from that construction. But again, you'll probably see more UVA students graduating with more debt if they're living on the grounds. That'd be my bet.
So we've got about 7 minutes or so. I do not see any other questions in the feed. Am I missing something, Stacey?
I see one more. There was
Okay.
one. Keith, there was one that came across specifically about transit and moving beyond what Jaunt provides. So
would you love to tackle that?
yeah, sure. So to paraphrase the question, which is up in the chat, is there talk anywhere about collaborating to develop a multi-county transportation system to serve populations that work in Seville but can't afford to live there? And John is making the point. Jaunt is wonderful, but doesn't really serve people, every day of the week and at all times. And I think, yeah, that is an important point. And one of the things that, I'm excited about is that there is real movement. Unlike a lot of bigger cities, Charlottesville has never had an integrated view of transportation. The city runs CAT, the county contracts for it. UTS, the university, again, the elephant, runs its own transit system. And then there's Jaunt, which really was meant to be what we call in the industry paratransit, kind of providing mobility for those who really can't find it in any other way. And so that kind of mess of organizations is finally talking to one another. The county is finally investing in a transit plan to see what the county really needs. And then I think, we're already confronted, if you look at the data for UVA and broader data on people coming from the Shenandoah Valley, from Fluvanna, from beyond to come to Charlottesville, that integrated transportation system has to happen, and transit specifically. There are small investments being made, absolutely. There's now the Afton Express, bringing folks in from the Shenandoah Valley through Afton into the city, but there's a lot more work that has to be done. So there's a lot of talk, a little bit of investment, and maybe we'll get a lot more investment if we keep at it. That's the hope. And Virginia's rail investments speak to, again, we even got an article, in the Washington Post about how weird it is that Virginia is a major rail investor. So there are things happening, again, on the transportation side that give me some hope.
Thanks for tackling that, Andrew. I appreciate that. Just a little thing. I got a notice this morning, and it looks like we might have a question here.
Keith, can I say there was one question that came in early on, and it was specifically related to the rent relief program and evictions. And it's really acknowledging that the rent relief program is really just addressing that immediate need that so many more families than we're used to had in, with the pandemic. And eviction prevention programs that are available, none of that really seems to be enough. And so Kate, this is directed specifically towards you. Do you have any thoughts on long-term solutions?
I have so many thoughts on long-term solutions. I mean, one of the things, I would say one of the things about rent relief, and then I'll kind of go beyond that, is that one of the things we found, and we're getting ready to put out a piece on this from the lab, which is that, it is way more expensive to evict somebody and deal with all of the social services systems, right? The cost of healthcare, emergency room, police, homelessness, all of that is way more expensive than providing rent. So expansion of vouchers would be a big piece of this, right? So a state level voucher, a housing voucher that would actually be more useful. Okay, so that's the rent relief side. The other side is, though, that once you've been evicted once, that stays with your record pretty much a long time, like years and years and years. And so and it's totally okay if a landlord says, oh, you've been evicted, I don't rent to people who've been evicted. So that starts to make the options for housing smaller and smaller and smaller, so that people who could pay a regular rent end up in places like extended stay motels. They end up in buildings that are of poorer quality. And this impacts things like access to work. It impacts health. It impacts education. It also sort of begets more instability. So I would say that record sealing would be a really critical piece of this. So sealing the eviction records. There are various ways that folks have done this. Sometimes it's sealed if it never actually gets the judgment. Sometimes it's sealed within 3 years. Sometimes it's sealed within less than that. Different states have different rules, but that's definitely something that should be thought about here in Virginia. And most of the landlord tenant law in Virginia is in fact state level. So that's why I'm kind of talking at the state level. The other thing is thinking about a right to counsel. We know from other places that tenants, and we know from Virginia that tenants almost never have representation in court while landlords always do. And so if you come in with no representation, it doesn't matter what your defense is, you're probably going to lose. And so we think a lot about the question of, we've actually increased through both philanthropic and state sources, access to counsel. And so there's been this ongoing conversation about moving towards a right to counsel so that there's sort of an equal playing field. Those are just two of the pieces that have been discussed lately. Of course, affordable housing, but we got 2 minutes left and I could talk about this all day.
No, okay, thank you again, good professor. Look, we've got about 2 minutes. We're running a little bit long here, and we're trying to be respectful of everybody's time. Hamilton, Andrew, Kate, thank you for participating. I want to take a moment and say thank you to staff. This is the final of the spring service series, particularly the Dr. Stacy Pepiev. She put a ton of time and energy into this. I know firsthand how difficult it is to do this on a regular basis and how difficult it is to manage all 3 panelists, try to get some good information out there and do it all within 60 minutes and trying to keep me to shut up. So look, this is the end of this series. I just want to thank everybody, the staff, and all our sponsors from Bramante Homes. I believe I've missed this. I believe this was sponsored today by the Nelson County Community Development Foundation. So I apologize, folks, that we love Nelson County. We love all the great things you do out there. So I apologize for not recognizing you in the beginning. We have a survey to take. Please fill it out. It helps us get better. Please be as thoughtful and critical as you possibly can. We just will make this series better. And if I can get couple more seconds, we will be doing a fall series, and that announcement will be coming a little bit later on it. But your survey will help us inform what we're doing in the future. So unless I've missed anything, and we are coming up just about at 1 o'clock, Stacy, is there anything else I missed or I need to add?
No, that was everything. And I want to thank all of our panelists again. I think this was a great conversation. And I hope we can continue it because it's something I can talk about for hours as well. So I like being part of these types of discussions. Thank you.
So Hamilton, Kate, and Andrew, I'm going to ask you to stay on for a couple of minutes. I just want to chat with you about something real quick. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And if you haven't received it, get the color of law. All righty. So who?